Today, we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Peter Dexter.
Back once again here, and an opportunity for us to talk about a number of really important issues today here on Point of View. And if you would like to join our conversation, the number is 1-800-351-1212. This weekend, no doubt, you probably heard a few people making comments about Jeffrey Epstein. We'll maybe say something about that a little bit later, but everybody's got their theory, everybody's got their conspiracy theory, and I'll certainly maybe dive into that a little bit later on in the program. But there are other things to talk about, because one of the focuses that we always like to have on this program is what's going to affect your faith, your family, or your freedom, what's going to affect you individually. And even though there are certainly a lot of people today talking about the apparent suicide, I'll leave it at that. There are some other topics that certainly I want to address. One of those next hour is going to be one that we're going to do with our friend Dr. Frank Wright. He has written quite a bit on the subject of socialism, but one of these very helpful booklets is entitled "When Truth Becomes the Enemy, the Insanity of Our Reckless Embrace of Socialism." So I thought I'd at least let you know about some of the things he's been talking about there. He also has done more recently a video commentary about these drag queen readings in public libraries, so I might get him to mention that as well, and just all the good work that is being done there at D. James Kennedy Ministries, place where he has worked for many years. Matter of fact, he was the CEO of the Center for Christian Statesmanship that was put together by D. James Kennedy, and with the passing of D. James Kennedy, they brought him back, and certainly want to spend some time talking with him by phone. And then the third hour, we're going to be spending some time talking with our good friend Jim Denison, author of a number of different books and the man that writes the daily article, and the co-founder and CEO of the Denison Forum. So we're going to spend some time with him as well. So lots of things to address. We'll spend some time talking about each one of those issues. And we have articles about both of those individuals on our website. But tucked in between those, I also have one other one that I wanted to address for just a minute. If for no other reason, then there is a lot of misinformation. Even on Friday, you might remember I started out with that famous quote that comes from the former senator from New York, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And I paraphrase it now because he used to use the word man, and we're supposed to not use that because that would be sexist. So I say the person. So I just paraphrase it slightly, but that is, people are certainly free to have their own opinions, but they're not free to have their own facts. And a good example of that is surfacing in the way in which the media has been covering some of these ICE raids, or these ICE enforcement raids, or whatever phrase you want to use. Just the fact they're called raids is a little bit upsetting to the man who at the moment actually is the acting commissioner of ICE, of Customs and Border Protection, and an individual that certainly has been trying to continue to follow the law, even in the midst of all the controversy. So the other day, he's on with CNN Jake Tapper, who said, "You and the president just said a few weeks ago that the pending ICE raids coming down the pipe were going to be focusing on violent criminals. That's not what is happening down here in Mississippi. Why not?" And this had to do with the fact that the government arrested a number of illegal immigrants in this particular venue there in Mississippi. So first of all, the response, interestingly enough, from this individual, Mark Morgan, was, "I never made those comments." He said, first of all, I have never said that the raids, as you call them, were focused on violent criminals. I've never said that. And he said these aren't raids. These are targeted law enforcement operations. And in this case, this is a joint criminal investigation with ICE, as well as the Department of Justice targeting worksite enforcement. So Jake Tapper wasn't content with that, so he went back and then repeated the line verbatim that you said, okay, these are indeed raids, and you said you would go after criminal aliens. And so, again, now you're going after people that have actually responded to or committed various additional crimes, which is why then Mark Morgan went back and said, quote, that was my response to a question about priorities, and ICE's priorities will always be to go after criminal aliens as a priority, but that doesn't mean we exclude all demographics. We still have to apply consequences, meaning enforce the rule of law for those individuals who are here illegally against immigration law. And the point he's making is you can pull one quote out of context in which they're saying, what's your priority? And he said, well, obviously our priority is first to go after criminals. That's what you might call low-hanging fruit, or might be the highest priority, whatever metaphor, illustration you want to use. But just because we are focusing our first attempts at people that are criminal aliens doesn't mean that we aren't going to enforce the law as well. So, again, they weren't finished, and so then Jake Tapper shows this one particular clip. And if you've not seen this clip, it has made the rounds on Facebook, but it's worth mentioning that it shows this 11-year-old girl crying and asking for her father, who is going to be now returned because of deportation. And again, Mark Morgan went on to say, I know it's emotional. I know it's done on purpose to show a picture like that. But nevertheless, he wanted to still, even in the midst of that very emotional issue, because after all, we live in a world now where facts don't matter. It's all emotions. But nevertheless, he pointed out that the employment of illegal aliens is not a victimless crime, he pointed out, and typically accompanies Social Security fraud and other identity fraud. So this idea that the only law they broke was the law to cross into this country, first of all, is false. But then he went on to even add to that, her father committed a crime, and just so the American people know, this girl was with her mother at home that night, reunited with her mother within a few hours after that particular video clip. So the point I'm making is that when you see some of these video clips, when you read some of these articles, it's important to know the rest of the story. A while back, I remember one of the ones we talked about on the air was pointing out this individual had served in the military, and now he's going to be deported. And everybody said, look, he actually served in the military for the United States. Yeah, and he was also removed from his political office because of all sorts of malfeasance. And so you can check these stories to find out that there really is another side to that. And so, as we say on this program so many times, it is worth reading widely. And in this particular case, I recognize that there are certainly some questions that people are asking about immigration, about deportation. But at the same time, let's recognize that the primary focus by Mark Morgan, is upon those individuals that have committed a crime. But let's not just assume that simply because a person is being deported because they have not actually committed a felony, there weren't other crimes actually committed. And he spends a fair amount of time, if you want to watch that whole interview, explaining that in order to come here illegally, you have to do a number of other illegal things to continue doing what you're doing, and that involves all sorts of identity fraud, Social Security fraud, and the like. Oftentimes having fake passports, fake driver's licenses. And at that point, we should, I think, enforce the laws. So anyway, that's just one of those issues I wanted to put on the table. You can read all about it on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Less than a month from now will be the third set of Democratic presidential debates. The field will be smaller this time, but the question is whether the debate and discussion will be motivating for primary voters. Mark Penn, writing in The Hill, referred to the previous debates as a panderfest. He knows something about Democratic politics since he served as a pollster and advisor to former President Clinton and has written some important books looking at social and political trends. You can get his perspective by merely reading 2 sentences in his second paragraph. He says, by the end of this endless debate, spooned out in 1-minute dollops, I walked out with a $1,000 a month check, an extra grand if I'm female, untold reparations dollars if I'm African American, Medicare from birth covering everything I need until death, and the right to cross the border without any real penalty if I'm from another country. He also complained that the same candidates who were critical of the tweets by President Trump about a rat-infested Baltimore made it sound like the entire country was worse off than this city in Maryland. America apparently is not a country in which 90% have health insurance, almost everyone has a smartphone, 64% own their home. Instead, it's a racist, misogynistic country dominated by fat cats and big corporations sucking the life out of all of us. Most of us probably don't know how to run a presidential campaign, but Mark Penn does. And he is disturbed that none of the candidates have a positive vision for the future. Few candidates seem to have a love and appreciation for the opportunities this country provides for so many Americans and immigrants who come here. A month from now, perhaps the candidates will change their message, but I suspect that the September presidential debates will be yet another slugfest and panderfest. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Affirm Films and the Kendrick Brothers, Overcomer, starring Alex Kendrick and Priscilla Shire, rated PG, in theaters August 23rd. Overcomermovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the things that show up on Facebook and, again, just give you a different perspective that might help you understand what's going on. And I do want to talk about one meme that's making its way around the Facebook community, and that is saying that all of these Democrats are going under false names. That's not true, and I'll get into that in just a minute. But there was another one that I thought would be helpful because Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader, actually has confirmed that when the Senate reconvenes in September, they're going to look at some gun control measures, and one of those is universal background checks. And when I heard about that, I said, okay, well, right now we require anybody going into a gun shop or even at a gun show to actually have a background check. Now, the so-called gun show loophole is what happens if an individual walks in there, sells a gun there or even outside of the show without a background check. Well, the idea of universal background checks, interestingly enough, seemed like, well, after all, we're already requiring that for various commercial transfers. Why shouldn't we also actually require it for so-called non-commercial transfers? And those usually happen when, for example, a father wants to pass on a gun to his son, for example, or something of that nature. And those are intrastate transfers. They're not across the state. And so I think, well, okay, not the biggest deal in the world. We, of course, really know. I think the inconvenient truth about all of this is it doesn't do any good. All the studies that have been done trying to show that background checks prevent evildoers from getting guns prove that it really doesn't work. But okay, apart from that, if you want to feel good about a universal background checks, that's the case. Until I read the editorial that came out the other day from National Review. And it said against universal background checks. And I'm thinking, why? What's the big deal here? And the point is, first of all, they point out it's unconstitutional because, after all, you have to recognize that the federal government can control transfers from intrastate, but not interstate, I should say, but not intrastate. Okay, that's a little bit of one, but the point it's making is more important. In order for this to work, you would have to have a universal national gun registry. Whoa, not heard that before. And they are pointing out that universal background checks require the creation of a national gun registry that can be used to check compliance. They say, indeed, without such a registry, the system is rendered useless because there's no way for the government to prove whether a transaction has been made in compliance with the law or outside of it. So the argument is that you would then have on some registry, even if it's not owned by the government, the argument being made right now is will be by a third party, that would then list every gun that is in the country and everybody who owns the gun. And you can see that that's a much bigger issue than it was before. Of course, they also point out that, as I said just a minute ago, these background checks certainly don't work. They've been implemented in a few states, like the state of Washington, Colorado, and also Delaware. So those three states passed laws mandating that all intrastate transfers include a background check, and it shows that it certainly did not work. And as a matter of fact, was being done with the idea to show how easy it would be to have compliance and how it wasn't threatening to anyone. Turns out it didn't work out, and of course it raises some important questions. So we'll get into more of that when the Senate convenes in September, but I thought it was kind of an interesting take on it that I hadn't heard anybody mention until now. Well, if you're on Facebook, you probably see this. I've seen it numerous times. I try to tamp it down by when I see it, typing in incorrect, because it says that Obama's real name is Barry Soweto, Ilhan Omar's real name is Ilhan Ismi, Christian Gillibrand's real name is Tina Rutnick, Bill de Blasio's Warren Wilhelm, Beto O'Rourke is Robert O'Rourke. That's kind of, anyway. Bernie Sanders is Bernard Gutmann, Kamala Harris is Maya Harrison, Pete Buttigieg is Paul Montgomery, Elizabeth Warren is Liz Herring, Cory Booker is Tony Booker, Eric Holder is Eric Himpton. And the idea is if these people can't even tell us their correct names, why should we trust them? Well, first of all, don't push that too far because, after all, Ted Cruz's name is not Ted Cruz. I just mentioned Mitch McConnell. His name is Addison McConnell. It's not Mitch. So you don't want to go down that road too far, even with your Republican friends. But here's the issue. Barack Obama, actually, that's what is on his birth certificate. Yes, of course, later his mother married an individual who had that name Soetoro, but that's not his name. Ilhan Omar actually did indeed marry somebody whose last name is Elmi, not Esmi, but she has kept her maiden name. There's nothing wrong with that. Christian Gillibrand, actually her birth name is Rutnick, not Rutnick. They spelled it wrong, but nevertheless, that was close. And, of course, her childhood nickname was Tina, but that's pushing it a little bit. Bill de Blasio, interestingly enough, okay, it turns out that his birth name was Warren Wilhelm Jr., but later on, when his parents divorced, he legally changed his name to de Blasio Wilhelm, then just Bill de Blasio. Beto O'Rourke, well, his real name is Robert O'Rourke, but you know what? Spanish for Roberto is what? Beto. And I think that's fine. I don't know why everybody's making such a big deal about that, although they did in the last campaign. Bernie Sanders actually is Bernard Sanders, and you say, well, then where do they find that one? Well, then it turns out that his father, when he arrived as a Polish immigrant, his name was Gitman, but that's not the name on the birth certificate. Kamala Harris, well, her name is Harris, not Harrison. So how did they get Maya Harrison? It turns out that's her sister, so that one's so off, can't even imagine. And then I just thought I'd take two or three more. This one led to more back and forths between me and a couple of people on Facebook, because the argument in this is Pete Buttigieg, his real name is Paul Montgomery. Well, first of all, I typed incorrect. Then somebody said, well, how do you get from Buttigieg to Montgomery? And so I type, well, Montgomery is his middle name. So then they come back again saying, well, then how do you get Paul from Peter? At this point, I'm really tempted to say, there's this thing called Google or Bing. You could check it out for yourself, but okay. Montgomery, interesting enough, is his mother's maiden name. And so his full name is Peter Paul Montgomery Buttigieg. I would have gone with Montgomery, but anyway, the pushback that you get from even trying to tell people that this meme is incorrect is amazing to me. But three more, just real quick. Elizabeth Warren, interestingly enough, was born Elizabeth Ann Herring, but then she was married to Jim Warren, and even though they were divorced, she kept the name Elizabeth Warren, even though she was then married to a man by the name of Bruce Mann. So technically you could say that's the case, but she's gone by Elizabeth Warren all these years. Cory Booker, well, his name is Cory Booker. Interesting enough, Cory Anthony Booker. But, yeah, okay, he has a nickname. Some people over the years have called him Tony. And then, of course, Eric Holder is Eric Plimpton Holder. And how you get that, Himpton actually is the middle name, and that's his father's name. So anyway, that's where this comes from. And the point I'm making is this is one of those things where there are just enough of these that are close to accurate to have this continue on. But the argument is that, well, if these people are using fraudulent names, that just shows that they're corrupt. And just for, if nothing else, Andrew's sake, let me point out all the Republicans we can come up with who don't use their right name. I mentioned Mitch McConnell. His real name is Addison McConnell. Addison Mitchell McConnell, by the way. So he goes by Mitch, which is his middle name. Ted Cruz, it's actually Raphael Edward Cruz, but he goes by his middle name, Ted. And that's fine with me. Some people say, well, what about Rick Perry? Well, it's James Richard Perry, in case you want to do that one. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos is actually Elizabeth Prince. The Prince family, very well known there in Michigan. And then just a couple more. Sonny Perdue, well, you probably guessed that one's not. That's his real name is George Irvin Perdue, and he goes by Sonny. And then somebody I've had a chance to interview, Mitt Romney. His name is not Mitt. Well, it is sort of, because his first name is Willard, but his middle name is indeed Mitt Romney, Willard Mitt Romney. So nevertheless, we can look at those posts. And if you find those posts, do us all a favor and simply say incorrect. That's not correct. Some of those are pretty close. Actually, a lot of them are terribly misspelled. But nevertheless, it's just a good example of something on the internet. Just because you see it on the internet doesn't necessarily mean it is true. So when we come back from the break, we're going to get into a couple of other topics that are kind of interesting. And then, of course, we will be spending some time a little bit later, the next half hour, with Dr. Frank Wright as we talk about the embrace of socialism by many people in our society, including the younger generation. All that coming up right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, and let me just mention that a couple of minutes ago we spent some time maybe wearing you out with this meme that shows up on Facebook, but the point I was making is that these kinds of things surface, and it's good to check them out, and it's good to, if you find that they are incorrect, to mention that. But sometimes the pushback is just amazing, and because I got such pushback on, well, how do we know this, or why isn't this, and oh my goodness, please, okay, we're just trying to deal with that. And more to the point, if that's the best argument that you might have, as Steve, our producer, just said a minute ago, that dog won't hunt, and if nothing else, those are the ideas that really are a distraction from looking at the important issues of the day. But speaking of hunt, I thought I'd bring that up for just a minute, and that is the decision that came down from Universal Pictures decided to pull down this movie that maybe you've been hearing about called The Hunt. And as a matter of fact, the Parents Television Council wanted to come on to talk about that, but I'll just read their quote because I thought it was good. While we are glad that Universal Pictures made a responsible decision to pull The Hunt from theatrical release, we can only wonder what misguided thinking led to the film ever getting produced or even getting a green light by studio executives. While we understand and appreciate that our cherished First Amendment guarantees the right to create a film like this, how could the studio ever think it was the right thing to do? Now, you might say, okay, I don't know what we're talking about here. The Hunt, what is that? Let me give you a little bit of history, because Kyle Smith the other day said this is actually a pro-Trump movie that got canceled thanks to Trump. First of all, that's stretching it a bit, but okay, I understand what he's trying to get at. That is, this one actually makes the people that were hunting the deplorables as the bad guys. So in a very indirect way, maybe helps Donald Trump, but I'm not sure it helps anybody because it would have been just one more of those violent films. And the producer, Jason Blum, he's done some of these Purge films. And if you're familiar with those, I don't need to say anything more. This film was originally entitled Red State versus Blue State. Okay, that gives you an idea of what's going on there, in which you had these rich hunters. They're part of what he called the private jet-loving Davos globalists who hate the president. And they actually have a desire to go out there and hunt down and kill the deplorables. First of all, that title was maybe a little too provocative, so then it was changed to be called The Hunt. And you may have seen some of the spots, maybe seen some of the trailers showing some of these sort of posh, I love how Kyle Smith puts it, urban TED Talk goers heading out in a safari to shoot members of the Trump voting blocs. And interestingly enough, the Hollywood Reporter put it this way. The Blue State characters, some equally adept with firearms, explained that they're picking their targets because they expressed anti-choice positions or used the N-word on Twitter. War is war, says one character, after shoving a stiletto heel through the eye of a denim-clad hillbilly. I won't read any more. You can see how violent and awful it was. But nevertheless, the interesting argument being made by some is that when Donald Trump and various members of Fox News and a variety of others criticized this, they couldn't see the irony in all of this because the film, which was due for release next month, actually would have probably, I think you could say in a very indirect way, support the Trump administration, support red states and all the rest. But nevertheless, I think we're all served better by not having a film out on the market in which various individuals are being hunted down as deplorables by those people in the blue states. And actually, the final blow, I think, came from a Trump tweet where he didn't mention the title of the film, but simply said the movie coming out is made to order to inflame and cause chaos. They create their own violence and then try to blame others. they are the true racist and very bad for our country. So, nevertheless, the film has been canceled. If you've heard anything about The Hunt, or here's another one, if you've seen somebody trying to get you to sign a petition or to send a letter to Universal Studios and Universal Pictures to cancel the film, it's been canceled, okay? Just wanted to help you know that, just so that you don't get involved in, again, trying to address an issue that has already been addressed. So this is turning into kind of a public service hour, but if that is helpful to you, glad to be of service here on Point of View. Let's get to one other issue that I have written about, and I'll do a commentary coming out next week. And I mentioned just in passing on Friday, but it's something that has actually generated multiple articles. I've just got 2 or 3 here to illustrate the fact that there was an individual. His name is Scott Pressler. He is an individual that is a conservative activist. He has been a Trump supporter. Most people call him a Make America Great supporter, okay? And he came up with this idea a couple of weeks ago, early in August, by the way, to actually go and see if they could bring together a group of individuals that would go and clean up Baltimore. So he issued a call. I found out after the fact that he actually waited fairly late in the game to not publicize this for fear that maybe Antifa might come and attack them while they were doing cleanup. So it is amazing to me that with very little advance notice, on that particular Saturday, they were able to get 170 volunteers to go into, I believe it was in West Baltimore. Yes, West Baltimore. And they worked from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., picked up over 12 tons of trash. I've taken the time to look at the Twitter post, and some of them are really powerful because they'll show a before and after picture. They'll show people cleaning up. At the very end, they show some individuals in that neighborhood that are almost tearfully appreciative of what has happened. And so you would think that after spending 12 hours on a Saturday cleaning up 12 tons of trash, you have any idea how much that is? I mean, it's just unbelievable what they were able to accomplish. You would expect that the local paper would applaud them, but the local paper was trashing their trash efforts. The editorial board of the Baltimore Sun ran an op-ed in which, first of all, they made this snarky comment, quote, "We assume it was pure motives that led a Trump supporter to lead a cleanup in Cummins District, right?" Now, first of all, let's allow people to state what their motives were. And Scott Pressler said this was not political. He saw a need and decided to do something. But okay, let's be honest. We live in the real world here. There were probably some mixed motives. But think about this for a minute. If your only motive was there to embarrass a member of Congress, Elijah Cummings, you could do that by calling the press together, picking up some trash on one street and going home, right? I mean, that'd be enough, or even just pointing to the trash if that's all you were trying to do. You have more than 100 people work 12 hours, picked up 12 tons of trash. They seem like they were motivated by more than just trying to embarrass a member of Congress. But here's the bottom line, and that is, if indeed they were motivated to do that, I think what the Baltimore Sun was able to do is work really hard to demotivate them. And in my commentary that I have coming out next week, I point out that in high school, I was the president of a high school service organization. We spent a day picking up trash, cleaning up the town, and then the local paper did a story. Now, if that story had been like the one from the Baltimore Sun, I doubt I would ever have been able to get anyone to join me again to volunteer for the next service project. So first of all, you didn't exactly encourage people, those 170 plus people, to go out and do this again, maybe even in another part of Baltimore, because you just made fun of them. But the editors, by the way, weren't finished, because they also complained that this cleanup, and this is their words, quote, "reinforce the tired image of our failing urban cores that poor people in this dilapidated city can't take care of their own neighborhoods," unquote. And, of course, that's a real contrast to some of the videos that I saw there as well. And my point that I'm making is that in this politicized culture, no good work goes unpunished. And it just seems to me that if you even question the motives of Scott Pressler and the 170-plus people that showed up, I would just be more inclined to say, whatever their motives, we're glad they cleaned it up. And I will be honest, there were one or a few statements in the op-ed that sort of said something kind of like that. But by and large, it was just pretty much a snarky comment about good work that was done by a number of people that could have spent their Saturday doing something else, but instead decided to clean up a neighborhood. Let's take a break. We got a lot more to cover. We will do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that on the top of the hour, we're going to be talking with our good friend Dr. Frank Wright with D. James Kennedy Ministries on his new book, When Truth Becomes the Enemy, The Insanity of Our Reckless Embrace of Socialism. I do commend to you my smaller book on capitalism and socialism, but in addition to that, which we're glad to send to you, I want to also encourage you to look at the link so that you can get a copy of this booklet that goes into a lot more detail. The detail is evidenced by the fact that there are 42 different endnotes and a lot of different pictures in it, so it's another resource that might be helpful to you, something that you could pass on to children that you know or grandchildren that you know that say, socialism's all about equality. This would really be good. This is a whole generation that does not really know about the Soviet Union, doesn't know about the gulags, does not know about the impact that so-called democratic socialism has had in European countries and even in the Soviet Union and Venezuela and other places. So it's just a great resource for you, and we'll talk more about that with him in just a few minutes. One of the questions that I knew was going to surface is whether or not some of these candidates are too old. Of course, I will not talk about the age of Donald Trump. I've already done that and had a number of people react to it. But interestingly enough, you're starting to see more and more people in the Democratic Party and even Democratic voters say, is Joe Biden too old? He's 76 years of age. And this particular article I'm reading from says, for some, age is nothing more than a number. I'm hearing that all the time now from my wife as we get older. Many elders are praised as being experienced and having wisdom. For others, the subject is frowned upon in polite conversation. But the author puts it this way. When you're 76 years old and running for the nation's highest office, your brain had better be pin sharp, and you best not constantly mix up facts. Biden, he says, conversely, can't get out of his own way. Talking about what he said in Des Moines this week, in which the former Democrat vice president and Delaware senator referred to the ex-United Kingdom Prime Minister Theresa May as the late Margaret Thatcher. Now, the writer says, big deal, right? The guy's only human. These two ladies have the same initials, albeit they're transposed, so maybe we should cut him some slack. Except the writer puts it this way, except he's made the same mistake before. As a matter of fact, I was just thinking about having heard it just the other day, and this gaffe is just one more example of Joe Biden's loose lips sinking his political ship. And so then he quotes from some of these individuals that are pretty sympathetic to Joe Biden and pretty sympathetic to the Democrat Party. One of them, for example, there is at a fundraiser, for example, where Joe Biden confused the fact that there were shootings in Houston today and Michigan yesterday. Well, that actually was El Paso and Dayton, Ohio, and instead said Houston and Michigan. And then you can follow the little Twitter feed in which Kat, don't know who Kat is, said, I liked him as VP, but it's time for him to step aside. He doesn't seem like he's as quick as he used to be. Time to put ego aside, let others take on Trump. So many of these people are actually potential Biden supporters just saying, I just don't think this person's going to be effective in challenging Donald Trump in the general election. And if that was not enough, in the second debate, you might remember that at the very end, he told viewers that they should go to Joe 30330 and help me in this fight, actually directing them to a website that does not exist. So that did not help in terms of getting any kind of support because he actually had the wrong set of numbers. And then, of course, the one that we talked about on Friday, which certainly has gotten a lot of people's attention, in which he also in Iowa declared poor kids are just as bright and just as talented as white kids. And so you can begin to see that even some people that would be supportive of this individual, Joe Biden, and even though among registered voters, according to the polls so far, he's still in the lead, you wonder what the future might hold in that regard. So I just thought I would bring that one up because now many people, even in his own party, even people that have supported him in the past say, 76 years of age, you really need to be pin sharp, and you're not. And this is not the person we think we need to have to go against Donald Trump. Just before I take a break, let me just mention that my Viewpoints commentary is there, and I thought I'd also mention my commentary coming out next week was one that even as I had a few people read it said, that's new, I didn't know that before. I point out the fact that we mentioned it on Friday, that most Americans incorrectly think gun murder rates have gotten worse, not better. That was actually the title of an article that appeared earlier this year in the Washington Post. And what I point out is that among the various demographic groups, some of those groups that are maybe most likely to be swing voters this time, one in particular, the suburban and small town women, had the least accurate view of that as well. And so the murder rate between 1995 and 2017 dropped by almost half. And so you might say, well, yes, but we seem to be hearing about a lot of murders, and a lot of those happen in a very concentrated area. The latest research that came out point out that half of all the murders in the country occur in just 2% of the nation's 3,000 counties. A good example of that is Chicago. Just before the shootings in El Paso and Dayton, according to the latest statistics, there were 60 shootings in Chicago. There were so many shootings in Chicago that one hospital actually had to stop accepting patients on Sunday because the trauma center was maxed out. And so you might say, well, I didn't hear anything about it. Well, there's a very good reason for that. If you can't tie the shootings in Chicago to the Republicans, to Donald Trump, it's sort of non-issue, and it doesn't get that kind of coverage whatsoever. And then when you look at the issue of gun violence, one other figure that I always like to put on the table, and I've mentioned it before, is the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention actually keep very accurate records about deaths due to firearms, so gun deaths. And so you can look at any year in the last couple of decades, and in any year you will find that gun suicides outnumber gun homicides by sometimes as much as 2 to 1. So when you hear about gun violence, you need to ask some fundamental questions. Are you talking about all deaths due to guns, given the fact that almost 2 to 1 of those are due to suicides? Now, again, you may want to say we want to have gun control to prevent people from having access to guns, but if they're intent on suicide, they'll find another way to do that, most likely. But that's one thing. When you also are talking about gun deaths, are you talking about something that universally affects Americans, or where half of all the gun deaths take place in 2% of the 3,142 counties in America? And so it's important to ask those questions, and those questions need to be asked, especially as Congress reconvenes in September and considers some of these gun control measures. We're going to spend a fair amount of time later on talking about the spiritual implications of that. Jim Denison will be in studio with us as we talk about the El Paso massacre and hateful ideologies with him, and that will be in our third hour. But if you'd like to find some of the material we've been talking about today, you can go to the website, pointofview.net. My commentary today, called Panderfest. That was something that was actually coined by one of the Democrats watching it, and it just is kind of a summary of what's been happening in some of these debates. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about socialism and why we should be concerned about the adoption of socialism in America. We'll talk about that right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We've got a lot to cover over the next couple of hours. I think you're really going to enjoy our conversation. In just a minute, we're going to be talking with our good friend, Dr. Frank Wright, and we'll be talking about this booklet that he has put together, When Truth Becomes the Enemy. And when I say booklet, it really is quite extensive, 42 different endnotes, and we're going to talk about that. And it would be a great supplement to the little booklet that we've been making available that I wrote a while back called A Biblical View on Capitalism and Socialism, which is kind of just a short read, but you're going to, I think, benefit tremendously from some of the material that he has there. And then in the next hour, we're going to spend a little bit of time later in the program talking with our good friend Dr. Jim Denison of the Denison Forum. We'll talk about the El Paso shooting, the Dayton shooting, as well as what he is going to help educate us on some of these hateful ideologies. So there's just a lot that we're going to cover. In between time, I'm going to have a little bit of free time to focus on a couple of issues and the apparent suicide of Jeffrey Epstein, some of the facts and figures that are incorrect about everything from gun violence and a variety of other topics that we will get into. But let's immediately go to Dr. Frank Wright, individual that is well known to almost all of our audience because he has served, first of all, as the D. James Kennedy Center for Christian Statesmanship. Then he was the president and CEO of the National Religious Broadcasters, serves, of course, as the president and CEO at D. James Kennedy Ministries, author of many great resources, and an individual that we certainly count on to give us great information. And this new booklet, When Truth Becomes the Enemy, The Insanity of Our Reckless Embrace of Socialism. Frank Wright, always great to have you on the program with us.
Kerby, great to hear your voice. Thanks for having me on, brother.
I thought we'd talk about socialism before we go. Also, you've done a very good video commentary on these drag queen videos and readings at public libraries and the rest, so I do want to alert people to that issue, something we've talked about as well. But I know you wrote this booklet in large part because you are concerned, as I am, that the younger you are, the more likely you are to say, well, socialism, I kind of like socialism. I'm all for equality. And not having lived during a time in which we had the Iron Curtain, the Berlin Wall, the Soviet Union, and maybe turning a blind eye to things like Venezuela, we have a whole generation of young people today that say, you know, maybe socialism isn't such a bad idea after all.
Kerby, I think you can make a pretty good case that we're living at a time when the real engine of cultural change is driven by those trying to redefine almost everything, trying to redefine sexuality, redefine gender, redefine so many things, and that's certainly true of socialism. They're trying to redefine it, and they're trying to make sure that they separate the definition that people understand from its history. Because the less you know about socialism, the more you like it. And the more you know about its history and what it truly means, apart from the cultural apologetic you might hear on a college campus, it's something to be feared. And that fear has been measured in tens of millions, some say 100 million deaths over the centuries.
And one of the things you talk about in your booklet is this idea of a cultural bait and switch, that if people go to Wikipedia, which isn't necessarily the best resource sometimes to use, and also the attempt to maybe have a distinction without a difference, speak to that, because that redefinition is key to the interest that I think many young people have today in socialism.
Yeah, I think that's true, and you're so right about Wikipedia. It's a great place to start to take the pulse of what the culture is saying about something. It's not a very great place to stop if you're trying to get a true understanding about something. Wikipedia uses a definition that who would not like. It's all for the welfare of everybody, don't you know? That these good things will happen, that we can redistribute income from the haves to the have-nots, and that ought to sound familiar to anybody who's familiar with the history of communism as well. And, you know, some of our friends, Kerby, have called the latter-day socialists around here really nothing more than 21st century communists. There's not all that much different. But the way the culture is being schooled on socialism today is about all of the problems it's going to solve. And, of course, it's taken decades of schooling at the college level to convince people that capitalism is a terrible thing. That was the predicate. Capitalism's a horrible thing and needs to be replaced. Well, by golly, it ought to be replaced with socialism, which is a great thing, and it will solve a whole host of societal problems. But people have no idea how you get on that train and what the stop looks like at the far end, simply because they've ignored the history of socialism. And so a working definition of socialism is the government ownership and control of all of the means of production in society. And means of production sounds like an economic term. It certainly is. It's all the land, labor, capital, and technology in society. The government either owns it or controls it, decides who gets it, decides who doesn't get it, decides whether you can go take part of an educational system that's government controlled. It really is the gateway to controlling every aspect of your life. But on the front end, it sounds oh so savory, oh so sweet. If we would just have socialism, all of our troubles would be over.
I might just mention that if you would be interested in this booklet or even the DVDs that go with it, we have a link to djameskennedy.org, and you can find it there. And there's actually a whole DVD set as well, 3 Big Lies of Socialism, this booklet, and others. And again, that just goes simply to D. James Kennedy's ministry. We think very highly of them. And so again, that will give you a chance to find not only that, and of course, if you click on the picture of Dr. Frank Wright, it'll also take you to djameskennedy.org, and you don't even have to know how to spell all of that because it's there as well. Well, we need to take a break, but when we come back from the break, what I thought we might do is have you talk about what you call the grim history. It would be helpful to have a little bit of a history lesson. For some of our older listeners, they'll say, yeah, this is familiar territory. But from some of our younger listeners, when you talk about the number of people that died so that socialism or communism could be tried, you have to sort of educate them once again. And so this is one of the reasons why we wanted to spend some time talking about this issue. And then, of course, we have their various darlings of socialism today. Some of them are in Congress. Others are promoting things like Medicare for all and the Green New Deal and government ownership of more and more of the means of production and trying to close down various corporations. And so we'll certainly talk about that. And then this is not only just an outstanding book to give you some of the facts and figures, but it also has some action items, what you must do personally, what you must do politically. So, again, I think very highly and always have of D. James Kennedy Ministries. Matter of fact, that's how I got this booklet, because I sent in my donation, and I would encourage you to support them as well and find out a little bit more. And even if you say, oh, you are saying things I already know, I guarantee you know individuals, maybe young people, maybe adults, that are saying, you know, I think socialism's good because I believe in equality. They need to read some of this and be educated as well so that we don't head down the wrong road because it leads to destruction, as we found from history. We'll come back and talk about some of that grim history with Dr. Frank Wright right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Less than a month from now will be the third set of Democratic presidential debates. The field will be smaller this time, but the question is whether the debate and discussion will be motivating for primary voters. Mark Penn, writing in The Hill, referred to the previous debates as a panderfest. He knows something about Democratic politics since he served as a pollster and advisor to former President Clinton and has written some important books looking at social and political trends. You can get his perspective by merely reading 2 sentences in his second paragraph. He says, by the end of this endless debate, spooned out in 1-minute dollops, I walked out with a $1,000 a month check, an extra grand if I'm female, untold reparations dollars if I'm African American, Medicare from birth covering everything I need until death, and the right to cross the border without any real penalty if I'm from another country. He also complained that the same candidates who were critical of the tweets by President Trump about a rat-infested Baltimore made it sound like the entire country was worse off than this city in Maryland. America apparently is not a country in which 90% have health insurance, almost everyone has a smartphone, 64% own their home. Instead, it's a racist, misogynistic country dominated by fat cats and big corporations sucking the life out of all of us. Most of us probably don't know how to run a presidential campaign, but Mark Penn does, and he is disturbed that none of the candidates have a positive vision for the future. Few candidates seem to have a love and appreciation for the opportunities this country provides for so many Americans and immigrants who come here. A month from now, perhaps the candidates will change their message, but I suspect that the September presidential debates will be yet another slugfest and panderfest. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Affirm Films and the Kendrick Brothers, Overcomer, starring Alex Kendrick and Priscilla Shire, rated PG, in theaters August 23rd. Overcomermovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us Dr. Frank Wright for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, When Truth Becomes the Enemy, and the subtitle, The Insanity of Our Reckless Embrace of Socialism. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. After he leaves, we'll have an open line. I'm going to get into a couple of other issues in terms of the ICE raids, some of the things happening in the campaign, some questions that people are raising about universal background checks, gun violence, and a variety of other issues. So there will be lots of things to discuss, but if you'd like to join us, we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. We have a link, of course, to D. James Kennedy Ministries on our website. And I thought for just a minute, Frank, we might talk about this grim history. I know for our older listeners, they're well aware of what it was like to live in China, or even today to live in China, to live in the Soviet Union and things of that nature. But for some of our young people, this is new information. So educate us, if you might.
Well, Kerby, I mentioned in the booklet that Thomas Hobbes, a historian and political theorist, made a description of life in the Middle Ages, and it was actually his call for strong government, strong central government. He described life at that time as being nasty, poor, solitary, brutish, and short. And that's a pretty good description of what socialism looks like as well. The government has a tendency, when it has control, to use people in socialist systems as though they are totally expendable, and the death rate demonstrates that. In fact, the social scientist and political scientist R.J. Rummel actually coined a phrase that probably most people are not familiar with. We know what genocide is, but what is democide? he coined the phrase to describe socialist governments, who he describes democide as the murder of any person or people by their government. And the best estimates are, Kerby, as you well know, that 109 million people in the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century have been killed at the hands of their own government. This is not the people that died in World War II from collateral damage or some enemy. This is people being killed by their own government. Socialism has a terrible legacy. It's a legacy literally bathed in blood. And it generally ends up that way because of the failure of the basic system itself. Socialism does not deliver to its citizens the goods and services and things that they need to sustain livelihood. And witness the Ukrainians in the early part of the 1930s. The Russians who controlled Ukraine starved 7 million Ukrainians to death. Now, if you know anything about Ukraine, I've visited it a number of times. It was called the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. The soil there, the topsoil there is so fertile that it produces an abundance. And so in the 30s, the Ukraine produced an abundance as well, but the Soviets took all of the food, exported it to get hard cash foreign currency reserves, and the Ukrainians starved to death. People are the expendable element under every socialist system that's ever existed.
Let's also talk about this from a Christian point of view, and that is I address this often on the program where people maybe look in the book of Acts and say, well, that looks like socialism. Well, first of all, it was voluntary. It wasn't the means of production. You still had private property. But really, as you talk about in this booklet, the very heart of socialism is atheistic, and people need to understand that as well. If you've ever studied this, and I did when I was at Georgetown, studied under a Marxist, so I would have a chance to take the time to read Karl Marx and Lenin and Stalin and Mao and watch some of the kids that were already sort of interested in Marxism or came from countries where there was sort of a Marxist flair, yet its very core, it is atheistic, is it not?
It is, and for a very simple reason. Socialism, in order to be implemented successfully, let's put successfully in quotation marks, successful just means that those who are running the show are able to get the maximum power that they want. In order for socialism to work, it has to control all other sources of authority. And historically, the two sources of authority that have stood in the face of socialism are the church and the family. And so when you have competing authority structures, socialism will attempt to dismantle the authority of any other competing authority structure, which is what you saw the Russians do. In the communist revolution, Soviet Russia became the first nation in the history of the world that had as an avowed goal, you might call it a public policy goal, the destruction of religion. Why? Because it stood in the face of in place of the communist ideal, and it claimed an authority over mankind that socialist government would not allow. The same thing is true about the family. Parental authority. No. Under socialism, there is no such thing. So any competing authority structure must be done away with, and so socialist systems must, by definition, be atheistic in order for them to be able to obtain the full control they're looking for.
And again, this book is entitled When Truth Becomes the Enemy, and if you find yourself saying, I'd like to get a copy of that book, or maybe you'd also be interested in the DVD, The Three Big Lies of Socialism, we have a link to djameskennedy.org. You just click on which option, and you can order it from them. That actually goes to their website, so I just wanted you to know that. Of course, on our website, we also have my piece on capitalism and socialism, and anything we can put in your hands to actually help you educate yourself, but also to warn the next generation, we would certainly want you to do so. But Frank, I'd be misusing some of my time if I didn't spend just a minute or two hearing from you about your most recent video commentary. I love to watch you. You are so good in front of a camera, and you are so articulate. But a lot of people are just now hearing about this drag queen story hour. And you've done, I think, a very good job of educating us about that. And that's another reason why I hope our listeners will go to D. James Kennedy Ministry and find out a little bit more. But as you've investigated this, what have you found?
Well, Kerby, you're very kind as always, and I appreciate those kind words. One of the things, in fact, this expression goes to former Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who once said, "There's an effort underway to define deviancy downward." In other words, to normalize it. And that's what we see happening in our culture in so many respects today. It's part of this redefinition that you and I spoke about earlier. And so the effort that we're talking about it's a partnership among public libraries with, how shall we say, with people from the drag queen community, or people that engage in dressing up, men dressing up as women. And the public libraries, yes, taxpayer-funded libraries, are funding little engagement hours where drag queens will come into the library in full regalia and read stories to young children. And the parents bring them in, and we look at the drag queen, and over time we see, oh, well, this is something very different. I'm not used to that. But then it becomes something that familiarity makes it more acceptable. So there's been quite an uproar about this, but so far this is just another example of the way the enemy will try to remove God's law, God's definition of human sexuality, and replace it with something altogether different. Drag queens have been around for a long time, but who would have thought 30 years ago that the gay agenda would include also gender confusion of the kind that we see, where people claim that their gender is not fixed, it's fluid, they can go back and forth anytime they want? Who would ever thought we would see public institutions like our libraries, who we trust our children to be able to go there, conducting something like this where they're just normalizing deviancy.
Yeah, defining deviancy down. And, of course, when evil becomes good and good becomes evil, the other day we had Brad Dacus on defending a pastor who was going just to find out more and was arrested because he disapproved of what was happening. And I think the pastor even said, 20 years ago we'd be arresting the people in the public library. Now we're arresting me. And so it just illustrates why we need to know more about these issues. So, again, we have a very good link to djameskennedy.org. You can find out more about not only this material on socialism, but also if you'd like to see some of the commentaries that Frank Wright does, those are available as well. Count you as a good friend, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
I do as well, Kerby. The Lord bless you, brother.
Let's take a break. We've already got some phone calls, so when we come back, I'll take the calls first, and then I'm going to put some things on the table. Some questions about the attempt to actually deport a number of individuals, and I put that as one of our articles up there as well, where you have the acting commissioner of Customs and Border Protection being kind of grilled by Jake Tapper, so I wanted you to see that. Some people now starting to suggest that 76-year-old Joe Biden is just making so many mistakes out on the campaign trail. Maybe it's time for him to set down. And then we'll get into some other issues, universal background checks, gun violence, and a variety of other topics. So all of that coming up. And if you would like to join us, that open line is now here, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take those calls, and I'll have some comments right after this.
From Affirm Films, Provident Films, and the Kendrick Brothers comes Overcomer. John Harrison is a frustrated coach questioning his value until he crosses paths with a student struggling on her own journey.
What have you allowed to define you? When you find your identity in the one who created you, it'll change your whole perspective.
Overcomer, starring Alex Kendrick and Priscilla Shirer. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. In theaters August 23rd. More information is available at overcomermovie.com.
It's been said that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes. That was definitely true in the 19th century when preacher Charles Spurgeon said it. But here in the 21st century, truth can be just as fast. Think about it. When Point of View presents the truth, it reaches people across America and around the world instantly. You make that instant truth a reality when you join the Point of View Radio Truth Team. Get all the details now at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's take some of those phone calls. We've been talking about this subject of socialism. Again, let me just mention my booklet on capitalism and socialism. I'll talk about more what's in it in just a minute, but also certainly wanted you to know about this piece by Frank Wright as well. Let's go to Larry in Indiana. What would you like to add to our conversation today?
Well, thank you for taking my call. We're referencing
religion in general, I know you're familiar with an individual called Richard John Newhouse.
Oh, sure. I've met him and been with him at various events over the years. Of course, he's no longer alive, but yes, really benefited tremendously by his work. Go ahead.
Right. And one of his quotes, I think, explains it very well concerning religion. He said, socialism is the religion people get when they lose their religion. And I'd like to put forth a tactic that the old Soviet Union used to use in their educational systems, and that is this. They used to bring two plants into a classroom of small kids, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. They put them on the windowsill, and they tell the children to water one of those plants daily. And after a period of time, one of those plants would wither and die. And then they would come back in, they would explain to the children the reason that one plant lived and one plant died is because there is no God. You had to take care of this plant. If God really cared, he would have kept that other plant living. That's one of the tactics they used for driving religion out of their youth.
Wow. Yes. And again, those kinds of ideas were inculcated in a whole generation of young people. But it is interesting that, as many of you know, and you probably do as well, Larry, here in the show, I go to Hungary every year speaking at Word of Life, which has the largest Word of Life Bible Institute in Europe. And so it's just kind of a good central meeting place for young people all over Europe. But it is amazing that, especially as I see that particular country, it is really moving from darkness to light. And the old parents and grandparents are warning the kids, don't go back. We experienced what it was like to live in an atheistic culture that was hostile to Christianity, a socialistic culture that was hostile to innovation, freedom, and entrepreneurship. And so it was those kinds of stories that, if you will, drained the life out of individuals. And then when I go to some of the other former Soviet bloc countries, especially as some of my colleagues do, go to a couple of those where that darkness still prevails because of those kind of stories that were told in the classroom for generations. So I appreciate you sharing that today.
Well, thank you. And that's why here in the United States I see it as a generational goal of socialism, because early on in the late 19th century, early 20th century, they infiltrated our universities. Then later on in the 60s, they got it down into the high schools. Now they're going down into the elementary schools. They're waiting for the older generation that can pass on this type of history to our youth to really die off. And then they'd capture.
I would think so, yeah. And again, when they look around, they say, well, some of the exciting people in Congress right now are people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Maybe I want to be a socialist like them as well. And so I think there's going to be a real education process, and that's certainly one thing we're dedicated to here at Point of View. Let me again talk about some of the resources. We're going to move on. You know, my little booklet I'm holding up right now for those of you watching online is a very small booklet. Each one of these booklets we make available at Point of View, they're intended to be read in about 10 minutes. So I'm not trying to give you all the information, although I do have a whole page of additional resources. But this one looks at some of the surveys that we've talked about, showing that the younger you are, the more likely you are maybe to think socialism might be as good or better than capitalism, or another third don't really know which is better. And so in some respects, that opens them up to the possibility of being influenced. Then it has a short section on the definitions of capitalism and socialism. And then I devote a section to doesn't the Bible teach socialism, kind of take you through Acts 4 and those passages and Acts 5 to just help people understand that. And then even give you a quick response to a couple of the, if you will, political, economic, and moral criticisms of capitalism, what are oftentimes used as arguments against a free market. So again, that booklet's available right here at Point of View. And of course, we mentioned just a few minutes ago, if you go to D. James Kennedy's ministry, this is, I hate to call it a booklet. It is in a booklet format, but it's 30 pages. It will take you more than 10 minutes to read, and it has various diagrams, pictures, and as I mentioned, what is it? I think 42 different endnotes at the end. So great resources for you there as well. Just before we take another break, let me get into a couple of issues. You will see that we have posted information about the book, When Truth Becomes the Enemy. But the second article I've posted here is the interview that was done more recently with the acting chief of ICE. And that's important because we've had some of these ICE raids, and there's some misinformation about that. So I thought just for a minute, I might mention the other day that the acting chief, Mark Morgan, was on with CNN's Jake Tapper. Jake Tapper said, you and the president said just a few weeks ago that pending ICE raids coming down the pike were going to be focused on violent criminals. That's not what happened here in Mississippi. For our listeners in Mississippi, they know the other day there was an arrest of, I think, about 680 individuals, maybe the most significant arrest ever. And so, first of all, Morgan came back and said, first of all, I never said that the raids, as you call it, were focused on violent criminals. I've never said that. I think words matter. These aren't raids. These are targeted law enforcement operations. And in this case, it was a joint criminal investigation with ICE and the Department of Justice targeting work site enforcement. Well, Jake Tapper would have none of it, goes back and quotes it again. And so at this point, then that's when Mark Morgan explains, and he said, wait a minute. The quote you're using here was my response to a question about priorities. And the priorities at ICE, Immigration and Custom Enforcement, will always go after criminal aliens as a priority, but that doesn't mean that we exclude other demographics. We still have to apply consequences, meaning enforce the rule of law on those individuals that are here illegally against immigration law. And so the point he was making is yes, we certainly want to, if we only have limited resources, go against criminal aliens, the individuals that have already committed a crime, but don't get to the point of saying that we wouldn't also enforce the law. And a little bit later in the interview, he did something else that I thought was very important and pointed out that illegal aliens really are not in the employment. He said employment of illegal aliens is not a victimless crime. First of all, it takes a job away from someone else who might be employed. Number two, most of those individuals, in order to be employed, have already engaged in identity fraud, Social Security fraud, may have a fraudulent license, a fraudulent Social Security card. Those are things which, if you are even in the United States legally, if you were born here or a naturalized citizen, you would actually be held for account as well, wouldn't you? Obviously. So that's the point he makes. And at one point, they even showed this one video, which maybe you've seen on Facebook. It's a footage of a crying 11-year-old girl asking for her father to be returned rather than to be deported. And he said her father committed a crime, and just so the American people know, that girl, her mother, was at home, and she was reunited with her mother within a few hours after that night. But the point he's making is that, yes, it's an emotional clip. It's done to actually play upon our emotions. But don't tell me this is a victimless crime, employing individuals here who are not supposed to be here, because as we have pointed out on this program, in other situations, usually in order to perpetrate that particular employment opportunity, they've engaged in identity theft, identity fraud, maybe had to produce other kinds of documents, maybe engaged in Social Security fraud. So it isn't just that they crossed the border illegally, and so that is certainly one of those issues to address. Just before we take a break, let me just point out one other thing that is starting to surface as well, and that is more and more people, even in the Democrat Party, are starting to say that maybe 76-year-old Joe Biden is getting a little too old. And one of these writers said that when you're 76 years old and running for the nation's highest office, your brain had better be pin sharp, and you best not constantly mix up facts. But he says Biden, conversely, can't get out of his own way. In a speech, he confused Theresa May to Margaret Thatcher. And as he said, big deal, right? A man's only human. We should cut him some slack, except he says he's made the same mistake before. And this is another example of Biden's loose lips sinking his political ship. And the other day, of course, we spent some time talking about how when he was in one particular venue at a fundraiser, referred to the shootings in Houston and Michigan. Well, the shootings were in El Paso and Dayton. And even one of the people on Twitter said, I liked him as a VP, but it's time for him to step aside. He doesn't seem quite as quick as he used to be. Time to put ego aside and let others take on Donald Trump. So more and more building up every single day in the campaign of Joe Biden. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, let me just mention the next hour we're going to be spending some time in studio with Dr. Jim Denison. By the way, this is quite a week in which we have Philip Yancey on with us on Wednesday, and we have Michael Ferris and a variety of other individuals on Thursday. And so it's just going to be a great week of commentary, and we're going to have a chance to hear from some really smart individuals. And, of course, we've already had a chance to hear from Frank Wright, and in just a little bit we'll have a chance to hear from Jim Denison. But let me get you ready for what's going to happen in September, because there's been a real push right now for the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to put a number of issues on the table. The first we'll talk about right now, and that'll be the idea of universal background checks. Then we come back from the break, and the next hour we're going to talk about the so-called election security bill. Now you'd say, well, we really want to have secure elections, but as our friends in the Wall Street Journal point out, Chuck Schumer is not trying to win. He's trying to win elections, not safeguard them. And so we'll get into why this will be of concern. But there is really a push right now to actually pass some of the legislation that would assure universal background checks. So when I saw this from the editors of National Review, it got my attention, because the argument usually is look, we already have background checks. I've purchased a few firearms over the years, and I go through a background check. Now that I have a license, actually, they only see the license. They don't even have to call in anymore. But the bottom line is that it's something that is done routinely. And on a couple of occasions, when I don't want a gun any longer, I go back to a shop and sell it to them so that then if they ever sell it as a used weapon, that person would also go through a background check. It gets a little more difficult when you have a father saying, I want to give my son this. Does the father and son have to go through background checks? And that's not the bigger issue until I read this piece, which I think is going to be very relevant to the ongoing discussion about firearms, because this particular article from the National Review says that Mitch McConnell has confirmed that when the Senate reconvenes in September, they will discuss the new federal gun control measures, including universal background checks, and that those actually will lead the discussion. So then they go on and explain that they would disagree, and I'm going, okay, you're going to have to explain why. Well, they say universal background checks appear to represent the inoffensive extension of an already existing principle. At present, the federal government mandates that an instant background check be run prior to the completion of all commercial and interstate firearms transactions. That being so, the argument runs, there can be nothing wrong with Washington extending that rule to private transfers, to non-commercial transfers, and to purely intrastate transfers. In other words, ones within the state. But there can and there is. They said the idea is unconstitutional. It requires the establishment of a de facto federal gun registry, long a no-no in American politics. It would considerably inconvenience law-abiding gun owners while doing nothing to prevent the problem to which that is being touted as a response. So let's take each one of those 3 points individually. Point number one. They say upholding the Constitution is a task that falls to all of government's branches, not solely to the Supreme Court. One cannot uphold the Constitution and pass universal background checks. By explicit design, the federal government is prohibited from acting outside of the limited set of powers that Constitution has granted to it. So it goes through and makes the case for it being unconstitutional. But given at least the past decisions by the court, hard to imagine whether or not those courts would have declared this as unconstitutional. The current court might. But that brings me to the second point, which caught me off guard because I've never heard this before. Because number two, they say equally problematic is that universal background checks require the creation of a national gun registry that can be used to check compliance. Indeed, they say without a registry, the system is rendered useless because there's no way for the government to prove whether a transaction has been made in compliance with the law or outside of it. So now we're into a national registry. The argument made by those who are promoting gun control is that this might be kept by a third party, but the government would still have access to it. Also, have anybody found any kind of registry or even your own credit card information that hasn't been hacked into anyway? So it's certainly one of those very significant issues there as well. And so that was news to me. And then it brings us to the third point, and that is they say the rather inconvenient fact that universal background checks do not actually work. You have a number of states, and our listeners, for example, in the states of Washington, Colorado, and Delaware, have actually passed laws mandating that all intrastate transfers involve a background check. And that bolsters the hope that they would see that these would be effective, and thus you could go from those states, which are kind of laboratories of democracy, into the national government. Well, they take the time to quote from one gun control advocate, who I'm not that familiar with, who actually concluded that these aren't the results we hope to see. So whether you look at this individual who's kind of a gun control advocate, or you look at John Lott, who's been on this program with us before, who is obviously a big skeptic about gun control measures, or you look at the RAND Corporation, which I quoted last week, which again found that all these different proposals for various ways to prevent mass shootings, that none of them would have made any difference. So you can look at individuals that are pro-gun control, others that are pro-Second Amendment, think tanks. They're all pretty much coming to the conclusion that background checks really aren't that helpful, because if an evildoer wants to get a gun, he or she can do so even apart from getting one that would require a background check. And more importantly, it would require a gun registry. And when that surfaces, I don't know whether or not that particular argument would go any further in the U.S. Senate, but we'll see. And come back from the break, I want to talk a little bit more about this other bill that will be considered in Congress, in the Senate in particular, the so-called election security bill. But while we're on guns for just a minute, where we'll come back to this, especially in the next hour, Jim Denison will be with us. We'll be talking about the El Paso shooting and the hateful ideologies. He's done some research on some of the white supremacist ideas and how we as Christians need to think about those issues and how to respond. But one of the other things that when we talk about guns that we need to get into our minds is the reality that, yes, there are a number of people that are killed by guns every single year. But if you go and look, for example, at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention data, you can look at any one of these years over the last couple of decades, and in any year you pick, gun suicides outnumber gun homicides by as much as 2-to-1. So first of all, when you are having debates about gun violence, you need to ask yourself, are we talking about shootings out on the street or people that have committed suicide? Now, again, some people wanting gun control may want to try to limit access to guns, but that doesn't mean people wouldn't commit suicide using other means. And back to another key issue, which I'll come back and get into more in the data after the break, and that is if you look at where most of the gun murders take place, half of them occur in just 2% of the 3,000 counties in the United States. And I'll say a little bit more about that when we come back from the break. So we'll look at a couple of the debates that will be taking place, especially in the United States Senate, on everything from gun control, universal background checks, to election security. But we need to take a break, and if you would like to read a little bit more about some of the material that we've posted on the website, please take the time to go to pointofview.net. My Viewpoints commentary today is entitled Panderfest. That's what one Democratic strategist referred to as the Democrat debates. You can read that and pass it on to your friends as well. It's all available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate 2 replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to spend some time getting into a number of other issues that will be before Congress, and then we'll have Dr. Jim Denison in studio with us as we talk about the shootings in El Paso and Dayton, but in particular El Paso because of the ideology that was part and parcel of the shooter there, and it's something we need to know more about. So he'll give us some perspective on that in just a few minutes. I've kind of held it off till now. We ought to at least mention Jeffrey Epstein. Most people have been talking about it, but this piece by John Hirschauer reminds us that the finance mogul and alleged sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein was declared dead, of course, on Saturday after he was found unconscious in his cell. His remains were transferred to the medical examiner's office for further investigation, but prison officials say he committed suicide, which, of course, some people were asking how he would be able to do so. He had attempted suicide in late July and was the most high-profile inmate in the country. How that happened and how he managed to commit suicide in a notorious federal lockup like the Metropolitan Correctional Center, which I did not know, but the Los Angeles Times, for example, referred to it as the Guantanamo of New York, and it is a universe apart from the Palm Beach County Stockade, where he served for soliciting a minor in 2008. But the Washington Post has detailed the timeline surrounding his death, which suggests not a conspiracy, but rather incompetence. But that didn't prevent people from, on Facebook, coming up with every possible conspiracy you can imagine, not the least of which, of course, pointing out the highly improbable number of coincidences in which people associated with the Clintons that have not survived, but we'll leave that for others to speculate about. And to get back into a couple of issues that will be in front of Congress that probably will affect your lives in more significant ways. The first is this ongoing debate about gun violence. The other day I pointed out something which I have in a commentary coming out, that an earlier article that appeared in the Washington Post had the title, which was very arresting, "Most Americans incorrectly think gun murder rates have gotten worse, not better." And yet the reality is the murder rate from, say, 1995 to 2017 is dropped by almost half. And some of those individuals who are most inaccurate and have the least accurate views are what might be considered swing voters. One of those groups I've identified before as suburban and small-town women who had actually the least accurate views about the murder rate, but many others as well. And so it could affect our elections, but more importantly, could even affect the way in which some of this debate takes place on whether or not we get various kinds of gun control legislation. Just a few minutes ago, I, of course, mentioned some of the concerns that have been raised about universal background checks. And you would think, though, that we have a murder rate going up because every time we do have a shooting, we get almost wall-to-wall coverage. But that's not always true either. As one individual pointed out just the other day, in the days leading up to the shootings in El Paso and Dayton, there were 60 shootings in Chicago, so much so that one hospital literally had to stop accepting patients because the trauma center was completely maxed out. And as I pointed out just before I went to the break, if you go back and look at the murder statistics, these are FBI statistics, pretty well documented. After all, when you have a dead body, you know you have a body. It's easier to count those than some of these other social statistics. You find that half of all the murders in America occur in about 2% of the nation's 3,142 counties. So, and a lot of those are, of course, linked to gang or drug activity. So, yes, there are things we can and should do, but maybe we need to have accurate statistics about those as well. All right, let's talk about another piece of legislation. There have been people literally coming to the Senate Majority Leader's house, Mitch McConnell, calling for action on everything from gun control to election security. And this particular piece reminds us that some of these bills might sound good until you dig into some of the facts and begin to understand why most of the people in the House of Representatives actually had very strong concerns about it. And though it passed primarily with Democrat votes and with one Republican vote. So not as bipartisan as you'd be led to believe. But let's get into this. This is what is called the Securing America's Federal Elections Act, or so-called SAFE Act. And the SAFE Act, first of all, has definitely a very big carrot up there, and that is that it has said it would allocate up to $600 million just in the first year alone to help states upgrade their voting systems. And the bill would also try to standardize and tighten election rules. Now, that may sound good, but first of all, there's the obvious concern about the fact that states should have the responsibility, the primary responsibility for these elections. And once you dangle carrots out there, you can see that they might not even allocate any kind of money and expect the federal government to essentially take over the election system in the country. Maybe not necessarily a good idea. So some of these are ideas that maybe have some merit, but there are some trade-offs to that. You can go through all of this, but the idea is that they are supposed to actually produce paper ballots. But here is kind of one of the sticking points. The bill actually trots out, they say, one of the liberal hobby horses. All paper ballots used in an election for federal office shall be printed in the United States on recycled paper manufactured in the United States. Okay, you got some problems with this. First of all, if you can get paper somewhere else for cheaper, why? But more importantly, some of the officials in the state of Oklahoma actually testified in June that given the sensitivity of some of these ballot scanners, if they were required to use recycled paper, we might end up getting false readings. So that's one of the concerns as well. Another provision says, to the greatest extent practicable, an eligible state which receives a grant to replace a voting system under this section shall ensure that the replacement system is capable of administering a system of ranked choice voting. You found in a couple of states, like Maine, cities like San Francisco, where you don't have to pick a candidate. You can actually rank them, say, 1 to 5, or if it's the Democratic primary, 1 to 25, which I just think is crazy, but okay. But another thing is that most of the Republicans actually voted down the SAFE Act after trying to propose some amendments, none of which passed. One of those was to delete the recycled paper provision. Another would have required at least a 25% funding match from states, forcing the states to have some kind of, if you will, skin in the game. And a third Republican proposal was to ban ballot harvesting. Now, when we come back from the break, I want to talk about that because that is something that I think should be done, but even that amendment was struck down, which explains why you only had one lone Republican voting for it. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Less than a month from now will be the third set of Democratic presidential debates. The field will be smaller this time, but the question is whether the debate and discussion will be motivating for primary voters. Mark Penn, writing in The Hill, referred to the previous debates as a panderfest. He knows something about Democratic politics since he served as a pollster and advisor to former President Clinton and has written some important books looking at social and political trends. You can get his perspective by merely reading 2 sentences in his second paragraph. He says, by the end of this endless debate, spooned out in 1-minute dollops, I walked out with a $1,000 a month check, an extra grand if I'm female, untold reparations dollars if I'm African American, Medicare from birth covering everything I need until death, and the right to cross the border without any real penalty if I'm from another country. He also complained that the same candidates who were critical of the tweets by President Trump about a rat-infested Baltimore made it sound like the entire country was worse off than this city in Maryland. America apparently is not a country in which 90% have health insurance, almost everyone has a smartphone, 64% own their home. Instead, it's a racist, misogynistic country dominated by fat cats and big corporations sucking the life out of all of us. Most of us probably don't know how to run a presidential campaign, but Mark Penn does. And he is disturbed that none of the candidates have a positive vision for the future. Few candidates seem to have a love and appreciation for the opportunities this country provides for so many Americans and immigrants who come here. A month from now, perhaps the candidates will change their message, but I suspect that the September presidential debates will be yet another slugfest and panderfest. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Affirm Films and the Kendrick Brothers, Overcomer, starring Alex Kendrick and Priscilla Shire, rated PG, in theaters August 23rd. Overcomermovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just give you a little bit more on this SAFE Act, which again is something that will be considered by the United States Senate. You have to recognize that when a piece of legislation passes and only one Republican votes for it, and I had to look it up, but it was Brian Mast, a Republican from Florida, then all the Republicans voted against it, and of course a number of Democrats voted for it and some against it as well. And part of that had to do with the fact that even though it has maybe the attempt to try to standardize our elections, the primary responsibility, I think, should be with the states. And more importantly, even when there was an attempt to try to delete from the bill a couple of things that might have been sometimes what are called poison pills, or things that are really not necessary in order to pass the legislation, but are put there so that it makes it possible for the other chamber to vote against it, and then they can say, see, they don't really want to support elections. You have to recognize that, as they point out, this might have been more of a political club rather than trying to really address some very significant things that need to be addressed in our elections. And so, again, when it was considered in the House, Republicans tried to amend it by, first of all, wanting to delete the recycled paper provision, which I think makes some sense, because if indeed we can find recycled paper from other countries, or if we recognize that recycled paper may not work as well as a paper ballot, what's the big deal? But that one was voted down. Another one was to try to have some kind of match from the states, because you know what's going to happen once states think there's free money for new voting equipment, they'll just stop getting equipment, and they'll just make the federal government pay for all of that. And the third point, which I thought was very significant and one that has shown up both in California and in North Carolina, is what is called ballot harvesting. If you're not familiar, let me point out that this is where third-party canvassers can go around collecting absentee votes. Now, the argument is that some of these absentee people can't get out and pass their vote on, so we will go and help them cast their vote. You can obviously see the potential dangers of that, going into an old folks' home where they don't even know how to vote. And so you just say, well, here, just check these boxes and walk out with that, or even in some cases collect their ballot and vote for them because they just didn't even have the ability to do so, and on. Or even as you're helping them collect their ballots, notice that they're going to vote for somebody you don't want to, and somehow we just managed to lose that ballot. I mean, you can see all the potential problems that could surface from that particular provision. And so in terms of election security, according to our writers in the Wall Street Journal, that's a no-brainer. Mail-in ballots should not be handled in mass by partisan actors. Many states already ban ballot harvesting. And this year we have, for example, in North Carolina, they threw out a House election because a Republican consultant allegedly went door to door amassing ballots, some of them which were unsealed. And so we have had to have that special election. Yet in the state of California, those of you listening in California know this only so well, it is allowed ballot harvesting. And one registrar in Orange County said, we certainly had it going on here with people dropping off maybe 100 to 200 ballots. Paid partisan staff can march around California taking possession of votes. And this is frankly just a recipe for fraud and just general mistrust. So again, that was another amendment that was voted down. So the SAFE Act did pass the House, but it only had one single Republican supporting it, Brian Mast. But that then, of course, allows Chuck Schumer to pitch this as bipartisan, and then wanted this bill to actually pass by unanimous consult. Really? Unanimous consent is something that is used when there is 100% acceptance of this. And then, of course, when that was not done, he said the Republican side doesn't care about interference in our elections, and the other is they want it because maybe they think it will benefit them. And as they said, this is just using this as a political club. So are there needs to actually firm up and to assure ballot security and election security? Yes. The SAFE Act, if properly amended, possibly could be one way to do that. So it's possible that some of the Republicans may take on the idea of these have a couple of good ideas, but we need to eliminate others if indeed there is no willingness on the part of the Democratic minority to allow any amending of the bill. Then I think you have a pretty good idea of where that will take us in the future. Just before we take a break, let me mention, too, that you're going to be hearing a little bit about The Hunt. And if you're not familiar about that, the decision by Universal Pictures was to pull The Hunt, which was a film that was supposed to come out in September. If you're not familiar with it, I'll just give you a brief rundown. But Jason Blum, who has had the so-called Purge films, which are very violent, had this new film, which was originally entitled Red State versus Blue State, which gives you a little bit of idea of why it was probably a good thing that this didn't go anywhere. And the premise is that you had, and I'm reading from Kyle Smith, saying that you have these rich hunters are private jet-loving Davos globalists who hate the president, are out to kill the deplorables. It was later retitled as The Hunt, but you may have seen some of these spots and these trailers and things like that, in which you had these individuals going out on a safari to shoot members of those who would support Donald Trump. Now, they didn't really say Donald Trump, but you know where this was going in terms of the so-called deplorables. And so our good friends at the Parents Television Council said, while we are glad Universal Pictures made a responsible decision to pull The Hunt from theatrical release, we can only wonder what misguided thinking led to the film ever getting produced or ever getting a green light by studio executives. While we understand and appreciate that our cherished First Amendment guarantees the right to create a film like this, how could the studio ever think it was the right thing to do? And of course, even the Hollywood Reporter gives you an idea of how gross it would have been. One of those is that it had, as they write, blue state characters, some equally adept with firearms, explain that they picked their targets because they expressed anti-choice positions or used the N-word on Twitter. Then it gives you some pretty gross responses that happen in this particular case. And so I think there was enough pushback, one, because of some of the shootings in El Paso and Dayton, but also due, interesting enough, to Donald Trump. I love Kyle Smith saying, pro-Trump movie canceled thanks to Trump. I don't think Donald Trump got the irony here, because actually the bad guys end up being those people from the blue states, some of those wealthy elites. But nevertheless, I posted a tweet a while back that said the movie coming out, he didn't mention the movie by name, but he said the movie coming out is made in order to inflame and cause chaos. They create their own violence, then try to blame others. They are the true racist and very bad for our country. Well, anyway, 3 cheers for the decision by Universal Pictures to cancel the movie. And if nothing else, just wanted to provide that as a public service, as we've done much of today, in which you see some of these Facebook memes and others. If there's somebody asking you to sign a petition to call for Universal Pictures to pull The Hunt, they have already done so. If people are outraged that this movie shows individuals from blue states killing people from red states, or people that are part of the media elite hunting Trump deplorables, that is no longer the case. So I just thought I'd provide that as a public service and something that you should look out for. And if you find somebody trying to gin up all sorts of response to it, you can say, that's already happened, and I heard about it on Point of View, and you can read about it in many various articles. We come back, Dr. Jim Denison is going to be in studio explaining the El Paso massacre, hateful ideology, and biblical truth. We talked a little bit about the manifesto, and even on Friday, we had Dr. Merrill Matthews read from part of the manifesto. We've even posted a piece by Byron York about what was in the manifesto, but there's a lot more there in terms of this idea of the great replacement and some of these ideas, these toxic ideas that are making their way through our society. So we certainly wanted you to know about that. And then most importantly, how should we as Christians respond? So there's just a great opportunity here to talk with our good friend, Dr. Jim Denison. Will be in studio, co-founder and CEO of the Denison Forum. One of the must-reads every single day is his daily article, and we have posted this article for you to find on our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We will come back and continue our discussion with Dr. Jim Denison right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, and this is a real treat. We have in studio with us Dr. Jim Denison, a good friend, an individual that I've interacted with on a variety of different forums apart from Point of View, but we always love to have you here on Point of View. He is the co-founder and CEO of the Denison Forum. As I've said before, one of the must-reads every morning is the daily article, and you have hundreds of thousands of subscribers. So this thing has just taken off, in part because of your son, Craig, I would have to say. And then the other day, we we had your other son on here. So this Denison family is very talented indeed.
Thank you very much. They have a great mother. There's no question about that. In fact, I often tell people I outkick my coverage, and they always agree. If anybody that's met Janet would absolutely agree that she's the star of the family.
Matter of fact, I have Ryan's book that he co-authored with you. I have Craig's book, of course, The 7 Critical Issues. Just the other day, I sent in my gift to the Denison Forum so that I would get the 3rd volume of Biblical Insight to Tough Questions. So there it is right there. So we want to also emphasize this. If you click on the picture of Dr. Jim Denison, one of the things you will see is we have a link to the Denison Forum, and that is available. But also we have posted this article here, which I thought we might spend some time talking about, explaining the El Paso Massacre, hateful ideology and biblical truth. The other day, we had Dr. Merrill Matthews in studio, and he took the time to read the entire manifesto. I don't recommend it for your quiet time. But the reason we did it is we also posted an article by Byron York. It was in Washington Examiner saying, has anybody read this manifesto? Yes, of course, the word invasion shows up. And if you want to blame Trump, fine. But there's a lot of other material in there. And you, as always, did the research to help us understand what was going on. What was going on? Because this man was influenced by some other things that we need to know about.
Absolutely. As you know, there's so much ideology behind the events that happen in the culture today. And it's not enough to see the headlines. You have to ask, why are they the headlines? Why are people doing what we're doing? That's why your ministry is so important, because it talks about biblical worldview as well as the events that are transpiring in the day. So what we're dealing with here is a particular ideology known as the Great Replacement.
Yes.
There's a French scholar of sorts, travel author and editor. He's written more than 100 books, named René Camus. He's no relation to Albert Camus, who back in 2012 wrote a book in French entitled The Great Replacement. His claim is that the what he would consider to be the Anglo-European and American civilization and culture is in danger. It's being threatened by immigration. And eventually what we're going to see is a replacement of the culture and the civilization and even the demographics that have made Europe and America what it is. And we have to fight back against this immigrant invasion because they're replacing our culture with theirs. Well, the person that was the shooter in El Paso makes direct, explicit reference to this great replacement in his manifesto. In fact, he calls it the Great Replacement in some ways. The Christchurch massacre against Muslims was directed by the same ideology as well. So there's an absolute worldview that it's work here. It's not just kind of a generic racism of sorts, as horrific as that is. There's a specific ideology at work.
Yes. And again, the shooter, and we never mention their names, and you don't either, but the shooter actually said, in general, I support the Christchurch shooter and his manifesto. This attack is a response to the Hispanic invasion of Texas. I am simply defending my country from cultural and ethnic replacement brought about by an invasion. Well, the various people in the mainstream press picked out the word invasion, and because the president used the word, and others have as well, that's where they went, but they didn't take it where you did. And that is, this is something that I think we should pay attention to, because this book, The Great Replacement in 2012, really is the foundation for a lot of this sort of white supremacism, sort of, if you will, the foundation for sort of a xenophobic response to all the kinds of things that are happening in America today, isn't it?
Absolutely true. And it's a different kind of racism than we typically think of as racism.
Yes.
Usually when you think of racism, you think of somebody who hates somebody else because of their skin color or because of what that represents. These people will say they're not racist in that sense. The shooter was saying he didn't hate Hispanics. He wasn't doing this because he was angry at Latinos because of their skin color or because of their language or because of their particular cultural background. He's angry with them because he believes they, as a people, are replacing his people. And that's why you could see the same ideology addressed against Jews and attacks on synagogues and against Muslims in the Christchurch massacre. That's what you're seeing in Western Europe behind this ideology as well. It's not directed at a specific race like African Americans or Latinos, and it's not even racial in the typical sense. They excuse themselves as not being racist. They think they're defending something more than they're angry at something. They would say it's not that we hate people, it's that we're defending something that we think no one else is rising up to defend. So they paint themselves as patriots as it were, and that makes this ideology even more attractive.
And, when we look at these shooters, we recognize that some of them, but not all, have mental issues. Some of them, not all, have seen themselves as victims. Some of them, but not all, are play video games. And any one of those factors in by itself probably doesn't make any difference. Because we don't see a lot of people playing lots of video games shooting people. We don't see a lot of people that have felt like they were victims shooting people. We don't find a lot of people that are mentally disturbed shooting people. But if you mix all that together with this toxic ideology, that is dangerous, isn't it?
That's the issue. And Kerby, what you just put your thumb on is what people are missing in this. They're pointing to one or the other of these symptoms, and they're trying to blame the entire manifestation, the entire movement on that symptom when the counter evidence is so strong. As you know, the American Medical Association has said that video games by themselves are not found to engender violent activity just by themselves, just as people with mental illness are not known to be more dangerous to population. But when you put these things together, that's the issue. There was a study that went back and looked at mass shootings going back to 1966. And they found these 4 factors that, first of all, these shooters, almost without exception, were themselves victims of some horrific event in their past, usually in their childhood. Second, they'd had a recent crisis in their lives. Third, they were activated by some ideology they had found. And fourth, they had access to firearms of some sort. Well, you put all those things together, and that's the issue. That's why it's not enough simply to look at gun control, or it's not enough simply to look at mental illness or at video games or even at early childhood crisis. What we have to see is the total picture.
Yeah, one other one, fatherlessness. I think
That's
26 out of the 27 did not have a good father relationship, so that is the case. But now one of the things I always like to use with Jim Denison is you are a former pastor and you write to pastors. I want for our listeners here that maybe are pastors, Bible fellowship leaders, Sunday school leaders, and others to think about how to respond, because it seems to me that we should speak out against white supremacism and against those individuals that are neo-Nazis. But at the same time, we also need to point them back to Jesus, as you point out, who was a dark-skinned Jewish Savior. Speak about that, if you might.
That's the place where we want to turn negative to positive, don't we? God's always in the business of redeeming. He redeems evil for good, and even the most horrific evil can be redeemed for a greater good. So we ask ourselves, what are some ways we can join God in redeeming these tragedies? And one of them is what you just said. We can be showing the culture not only that we're speaking against white supremacy and white nationalism and all that's inside that, but here's who Jesus is that makes him unique. Jesus is the one that loves all of us, regardless of our ideology, regardless of our background, regardless of our demographics or our race. Galatians 3, there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. We're all Abraham's seed. We're all heirs according to the covenant. So let's show the culture you can be part of one family with one father. You can have brothers and sisters across all the demographics and all the boundaries. If we'll stand up and declare the gospel is the ultimate answer here, and knowing Jesus is the ultimate way forward, then we're redeeming evil for good and using this to advance the gospel.
And again, one of the things you talk about here is that we should certainly treat those individuals that are coming here with compassion. In my article that I have on immigration, we talk about 2 issues. Number one, obviously to respect the rule of law, Romans 13 and other passages, but also to recognize that we should have compassion towards aliens and immigrants. And you have that in that section as well. And it seems to me those are the kinds of things that need to be addressed from the pulpit, don't you think?
Absolutely agree with that. One of the mistakes that I think some pastors are making today is they're thinking these hot button issues are going to be divisive in my church. I may have people disagreeing with me. I may have people leave the congregation or be unhappy in their giving or some such as that. When this is the prophetic moment, when our people are looking for biblical wisdom, they're looking for biblical truth. And I believe that if they'll see us speak the truth in love, they'll be drawn to our message. They'll be drawn. The Holy Spirit will draw them. And I think they'll be even stronger, more discipled members of our churches if we'll articulate the biblical answers to these difficult challenges.
Jim Denison in studio with us. And if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We have some information about this particular article, which I think you'll find very helpful. Came out just a couple of days ago, August 6th. But if you would like to subscribe to the daily article, you can do that. There's a daily article podcast. There are all these wonderful books here, 7 critical issues, as well as How Does God See America? And when we come back, a lot of people are looking for biblical insight on tough questions. And you've got 3 volumes of that, so we'll talk about some of those resources. But if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Click on that picture of Jim Denison, and that will take you to the Denison Forum. You'll find out about all the kinds of things that are at denisonforum.org. Maybe when we come back, I'll have Jim spend a little bit of time talking about some of the things that are available to you so that you can grow in your Christian faith, and especially for those of you in positions of spiritual leadership so that you can articulate biblical insight into these tough questions. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Jim Denison in studio with us for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, although I suspect you want to just sit back and listen because he brings a lot to the table. Let's, for just a minute, talk about what's at the Denison Forum, because we have the daily article, the podcast, resources, books, and subscription. And you have been able to build the subscriptions rather dramatically. But again, talk about what's available for all of our listeners, because it's been a while since we've promoted the Denison Forum, other than when you had your son on last week, which we did.
Thank you so much, Kerby. You're very kind to ask me about that. So there are a number of brands that are under Denison Ministries, which is really a larger umbrella. First 15 is a daily devotional resource that I'd highly recommend. Christian Parenting that my wife launched is terrific biblical practical advice. We have resources for pastors that we're excited about as well. And Denison Forum specifically as our cultural engagement brand. That's the part that I myself am directly engaged with. So I write an article every morning, get up at 4:30 to finish the article that we then email out to 180,000 subscribers in 203 countries. That's also turned into a podcast. I was initially recording that myself. I found myself to be technologically challenged in a way that even exceeded my understanding. And so we actually have a professional voice like you that records that now for us and makes that available every morning as well. And then all the social media that goes around that. I send 3 tweets a day that are specifically from me and then others on our team that do that as well. We have a very vibrant Facebook presence and social media presence that we're excited about. Just this last month, all of our brands together exceeded 1.2 million in our audience reach.
Amazing.
And yeah, when we started 10 years ago, there were 5,000, I think, on our subscription list. And so God has truly blessed us. The website has a variety of authors in addition to me that are reading and writing into cultural issues. The whole purpose of this is to help Christians, to equip Christians to use their influence to impact the culture for Christ.
One of the things I thought I might just mention is, as you said, you don't write all of them. Shane Bennett wrote one, 5 surefire ways to start a conversation with a Muslim. I thought I'd mention that only because our latest article that just came out on our Outlook magazine on evangelism, we have one whole section, which was an interview I did with a former Muslim who's now a Christian and a pastor in Frisco, who you probably know, talking about various ways to interact with your Muslim friends, neighbors, and coworkers. So that article, along with your book, which is the first time you and I really did an interview years ago on Islam, are just some great resources. So take the time not only to read the things that Jim Denison, or a couple of weeks ago, Ryan Denison wrote, but all the other articles that you post there as well.
Thank you. So glad to do this, Kerby. What you do is so similar to what we do. You do this on a radio platform and a publishing platform so very well, and we're on kind of a digital platform trying to do some of that as well. And it's really a lot of fun to partner with you to do this together.
Well, let's talk about Volume 3, because you have this wonderful biblical insights to tough questions. I know mine's coming in the mail because I just sent my donation in because I think very highly of your ministry, but you're answering some really good questions about what should I do when I don't feel close to God? How should a Christian address this issue of depression and medication? You're answering questions that a lot of pastors need to address from the pulpit. A lot of Bible fellowship, Sunday school teachers need to address, but they're afraid to do so because they're saying, I don't know how to do this in a way that's, if you will, academically rigorous, but at the same time biblically coherent. And so you're really trying to tackle some of the toughest issues out there.
That's our goal. In fact, this third volume is comprised only of questions that our readers asked us.
Yes.
Questions that were written into us or are given to us through social media channels in such a way that we knew these are some of the very issues that our readers are wanting us to help them with. What do I do about the issue of alcohol? What do I do when I don't feel close to God? What do I do about issues like depression in my life? What do I do about social media? How do I handle these things effectively? And so real practical present tense questions. So the background of that very quickly. I was the youth minister of a church in Houston when I was in college. And then my home church invited me to come be their youth minister. So the church I had been serving was so glad to see me go that they gave me a go-away party. And in that, they gave me a set of commentaries by William Barclay, the old famous New Testament commentaries. We used to call them the Saturday night special because so many preachers got sermons from them on Saturday night. So I'm walking out of the church to get to my car at this church in Houston. I crack open the first volume of William Barclay's commentary on Matthew, where he describes himself as a theological middleman. And lights flashed and bells clanged. That was a Damascus road for me. That was in 1978. A lot of our readers don't know there was a 1978, dinosaurs roaming the earth and all that. But it was April 9th, 1978, when I opened that, I saw that, and reading that, I had a sense that God was calling me to be that kind of middleman.
Yeah.
I was trying to have one foot in the academic world and one foot in the practical world, and trying to translate academic resources in a way that are practical and biblical and hopefully compassionate. And so, yeah, that's the motive behind this. Thanks for asking.
One of the other articles in there is how to vote. You know, this is going to be a big question because a lot of people say, okay, I'm not so thrilled about some of the things the current president says in his tweets, but I'm not so thrilled about some of the things being bantered around in the Democrat debates. Can you give us some principles about how to think about how to vote? Because this is going to be a big issue in 2020.
It absolutely is. And we see, as you know, some frustration on the part of evangelicals in this world because they really don't know what to do here. They don't sense that they have a candidate that feels exactly like who they wish they had available to them. The president, as you know, has represented a number of positions that are consistent with evangelical beliefs and evangelical theology, and yet a lot of his personal actions and his personal language have not been consistent with who we wished we had as a leader. Yet you look at the Democratic candidates and some of their positions seem not to be biblical to us. And so I've got some suggestions. One of them, of course, first of all, is to pray and ask the Holy Spirit for leadership. Second, evaluate the principles and the issues and the positions that are out there biblically. not through the prism of a Republican or Democratic or independent lens, but through what Scripture actually says.
Yes.
Look at what God's Word says on these issues and make your decisions based on what God has said on these subjects. And then third, evaluate candidates relative to what they can practically do about the issues that they're running to address. A lot of what's being addressed in the presidential debates, for instance, are not issues about which presidents have a great deal of direct authority.
Well said, yes.
And so let's look at these people in the context of what they actually are being elected to do, and do that through the prism of Scripture. And ultimately, as you do this, be gracious. Others are going to disagree. Let's not let these things be so divisive that they drive us away from the gospel and away from each other. In fact, patriotism is, I think, often expressed as disagreement. You go back to the Boston Tea Party, you go back to the first protests against the British monarchy, and really because you love your country, you want what's best for the country. And so if we're going to disagree with each other, let's not do it in a disagreeable way, but in a Christian way. Let's try to speak the truth in love.
Jim Denison in studio with us, and Dr. Jim Denison has, of course, the DenisonForum.org. And so, first of all, one of my suggestions is for you to go to the website. There's a place where you can enter your email and thus subscribe, and we'll see if we can get that number over 200,000 here real quickly. And that would be one thing to do. Number two, we, of course, posted the article. You can find it on his website, but we also have a link there explaining the El Paso massacre, hateful ideology, and biblical truth. And so some of that material is available. And you might also want to get the Biblical Insight to Tough Questions. Volume 1, 2, and now 3 is out as well, and those would be very helpful. So those are some great resources. And Dr. Jim Denison, we just need to have you here more often because we certainly have valued your insight. And thank your son again for allowing me to subject him to a little bit of a conversation about archaeology. It was just a great conversation.
Kirby, thank you for asking him to do that. He's a doctoral student in history, and he loved it.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful for you.
And I need to get your wife here as well because of all the writings that she does. So the whole Denison family, what a talented family indeed. So again, you can find out more about Jim Denison by going to the DenisonForum.org. And that's kind of all we have for today. Let me just mention that this is going to be a really good week. We have Philip Yancey on Wednesday. We'll be talking with him. We also have Michael Ferris on Thursday, along with a number of other individuals. Of course, we have our Friday weekend edition. But tomorrow, you know the guy sitting in this chair, Nick Pitts. We'll have the Millennial Roundtable. So those are some previews of some of the things we're going to be talking about here at Point of View. So if you want to find some of the articles we've mentioned today, they're all available on our website. The interviews we did with Dr. Frank Wright earlier, the last hour is available. The information, of course, with Jim Denison there. And so all of it is available at our website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to listen to it again, you simply click on that button that says listen. If you'd like to watch it again, of course, he was in studio, so you can even go to our YouTube channel and watch that as well. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.